Well, I don't know if you heard this story, but last week a man in Haifa, Israel, went to court in order to take out a restraining order against God. Did anybody catch this story? Well, according to the UK news organization The Independent, Mr. David Shoshan of Haifa went to court because God, as he said, has been treating him harshly and not nicely, those are his words, harshly and not nicely for a period of time. Mr. Shoshan did not go into detail about that part. However, he did apparently talk about how he has called the police to his home on at least 10 different occasions to make a complaint against how God has been treating him, only to be told by the police that they were powerless to help him, and that finally, literally after squad car with sirens through traffic arrived the 10th time, he was told that if he thought God had some sort of grudge against him, he should go ahead and try to get a restraining order, which is what he then went to court to try to do. I mean, this is one of those stories where I have so many questions, right? Well, to no avail, I am afraid, because the case did not last long enough to get into any of where my questions are and maybe yours. As far as the restraining order went, the judge did not agree, and he told him so. He called Mr. Shoshan delusional and threw the case out. And the punchline for much of the coverage, if you have not already guessed, was that unfortunately God could not be contacted for comment. While I don't know for sure, I can't help but think that this, God's unavailability for comment, is probably not far from the root of Mr. Shoshan's actual issue. Think about it. In those times when life is difficult, when it seems as if the power of the universe is tilted against you, we would like God to be available for comment. We'd like to understand what is going on. And because God is, after all, God, it makes sense that we're the ones who are supposed to be doing the changing if changes are to be made. If the universe seems particularly harsh and unyielding in some chapter of our lives, surely the solution is to seek God's instructions for how we are to get back on track. And yet, God is not available for comment. And because God is not available for comment, it is hard to know what is supposed to happen. Is it that God thinks that we're somehow not doing our job? I mean, what if we think we were? What if we were giving our job as we understood it everything we had, and yet? And I've had jobs like that. And at a certain point, when you think you've been doing the job and doing it well, or as well as you knew how, if you think you are following the instructions as you understand them, it is not long before, instead of going, you begin to wonder if God is doing God's job. And I wonder if that's where Mr. Shoshan is coming from, that for some reason he thinks God has decided to treat him like the supervisor from hell. And if that's what you think, it makes sense, right? It makes sense that the best thing for all concerned might be to just go ahead and take out a restraining order against God. I get it. I think Hannah from this morning's scripture might be quick to say she gets it too. She doesn't just take out a restraining order against God, of course, quite the opposite in her case. Her despair at thinking the universe is tilted against her is actually what pushes her toward God. If Hannah had been the one to have gone to court instead of seeking a restraining order, she would have been looking for a writ of habeas corpus against God. But she knows what it is to be bewildered by life, by fate, by what it is God seems to have thrown at her. And like Mr. Shoshan, Hannah wants answers. And yet answers turn out to be in short supply. In addition, it turns out that empathy for her situation is in short supply too. And thus, whatever its source in her deep abiding ache to be a mother, Hannah discerns that only God can really get it. Only God can understand where she is emotionally and spiritually. Hannah's husband, Elkanah, is a sweet and loving and successful and, a good enough man for the most part, but truth be told, he's a little clueless. Elkanah sees his beloved wife in her distress, and his instinct is to try to make it better, to say some sort of nice thing. There are a lot of people out there who just can't handle it when a woman starts crying. Elkanah's like that. There they are on their annual trip to Shiloh, off to give thanks to God for all the good things with which they have been blessed. And there in the hotel dining room, one of the other wives can't resist the opportunity. She can't resist the opportunity to dandle that baby on her knee just a little bit longer. Let the toddler fish through her purse for crayons a little bit more publicly. Let the boys keep making the Tower of Babel out of packets of equal and sweet and low for just a few more minutes. And maybe in a moment when Elkanah is otherwise occupied, maybe studying the menu, maybe going over to the bar and getting everybody's drinks, the other wife looks over at Hannah, who's just barely holding it together, and the other wife catches her eye, and she shoots her a long, thin smile. She's just one of those people who's like that. So when Hannah runs off from the dinner table there at the hotel in Shiloh, and Elkanah finds her back in their room, stretched across the bed, sobbing, he can't stand it. And that's when he says the stupid thing that he means to be nice. Has anyone ever tried to say something nice and ended up making things totally worse? I know you're nodding. Well, that's Elkanah. He sits on the edge of the bed there in that room with all the lights turned out and his wife just completely beside herself. And he says, Hannah, why are you crying? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? And here's the thing. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? And I think it's an important moment. I think it's an important moment in this story because it's at that moment that it just becomes so clear to Hannah that even the man who loves her most in the world doesn't get what it is to be her. He doesn't see. He does not understand. And unfortunately, this turns out to be a theme In the next part of the story, Hannah pulls herself together, washes her face and grabs her purse and goes alone to the temple at Shiloh, a woman alone, that would have been unheard of just right there, to pray. And the priest of the temple, Eli, sees her there all alone, and he sees her lips moving in prayer, and he assumes she must be drunk. He assumes she's there alone, muttering to herself, that she's there in God's house making a mockery of everything religion is supposed to stand for. And the point of that little detail is very simple. It's there to show us that even the religious guy doesn't get it. The guy who loves her most doesn't get it. The religious guy doesn't get it. Only God gets it. But like Mr. Shoshan, our friend from that courtroom in Haifa, Hannah is desperately seeking a remedy for the ways in which life has been treating her harshly. And so when Eli comes and tries to shoot her away, thinking she's just some sort of nasty hoochie mama, Hannah is ready to spit nails. And what she says is, "Not so, my Lord. Not so. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." And with this, something changes. Maybe he's another one who can't stand to see a woman cry. But in any case, the old priest in Shiloh, Eli, who is as cynical and as world-weary and surely not a credit to my profession as they come, well, he takes a second look. And this time, thankfully, Eli sees something in Hannah that moves him. Her humanity, her heart, her soul. And he offers her a blessing. He answers her, "Go in peace. And may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked." And the story reports she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Something changes. Here's why I think this story is important. Because this story is talking about events that took place more than 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. When this story happened, King David was still 2 generations away from being born. It is an old story. It's not an unfamiliar story. Because I'll guarantee you, there's not a woman in this room who doesn't know what it is like to be treated as if she is invisible. There's not a woman in this room who does not know what it's like to live in the shadow of somebody else's story of who she is, what she can offer, what she should want or have any right to expect. There's not a woman here who doesn't know what it's like to feel as if nobody gets it, and that nobody seems to care enough to really try. We know Hannah's story. We know it all too well. Now, as it happens, Hannah doesn't want anything particularly radical for her life. What she wants is to be a mom, and that was indeed the expected path. In wanting that path for herself, Hannah is not out there trying to blaze trails or crack glass ceilings or be a medical miracle or get her picture on the $10 bill. But in fighting for her chance to live an essentially conventional life, Hannah finds her voice. She finds her voice before God and man. And that proves to be transformational, not only for her, not only for her family, but ultimately for the entire nation and for all God's people. It turns out that her son, Samuel, will play a significant part in Israel's history. But that only happens because in a very real way, Hannah decides that she has standing before God. She decides that her heart has words that God needs to hear. And most remarkably of all, she is brave enough to believe, to have faith that God is willing to hear those words, to receive her anguish. She says to Eli, "I am not a worthless woman." And the transformation she secures is to shift where that emphasis is. It's not that she's a worthless woman. It's that she's not a worthless woman. She secures her standing before God. And she trusts somehow in her heart that God will not remain unavailable for comment. She finds the courage to speak, and God hears her loud and clear. So the great power of her story is not simply that she does, in fact, become a mother, although that, of course, is central to the story. Rather, the key point is that the love and longing in Hannah's heart are just too great for her to keep silent any longer. And she knocks at the door until God opens the door. That's why I think it's also important to remember her and to honor her today, on Mother's Day. Because Hannah stands at the beginning of a long line of women down through the ages, a long line of our foremothers in faith who noticed people that others did not see, who understood people that others did not bother to understand, and who stood up for a world where nobody has to live confined by somebody else's comfort zone. She's an early member of a long line of women who knew what that was like, but who refused to let the story just end there, not only for themselves, but for all people, and who therefore changed the story, not only for themselves, but for all of us. That's what this day is all about. Mother's Day calls us to remember the women who encountered a world that in so many ways continues to treat so many people harshly and not nicely. But in the face of so much harshness, rather than prompting us to seek a restraining order against the hand of God, it was the wisdom of Hannah, the wisdom of our foremothers, that what God's people need to do is find our voices. What we need is an unrestraining order. We need to claim the freedom of the gospel, the freedom of life in the light of God. They remind us that the love and the longing that are in our hearts must be trusted and it must be spoken, even if at first there is only God to hear it. It's the wisdom of today. It's the wisdom of our foremothers. It's the wisdom of Hannah. and it is the wisdom of a faith that moves mountains. May we honor it and honor them not only today, but always.